get into the real the real gist, which is this idea of what would you pay for 1,000 new customers, right? What would you pay for 1,000 new customers? And what I'm going to share with you is nothing revolutionary. In fact, there are going to be a handful of you on here, especially the folks from the world of Agora, that this makes total sense. It might be what I'm going to share with you a little bit of a different way to view the foundation of this business, but this is nothing revolutionary, but this has become kind of our new way, our even more simplified way of looking at how do we scale? How do we acquire new customers at scale? And so I'm going to walk you through the thinking behind this first, and then I'm going to pull out some numbers that we actually used and played around with. And I'm going to walk you through the thinking, the thought that went into looking at these different numbers and different scenarios, and then making decisions about them. And so again, this is about what would you pay for 1,000 new customers. And this starts off with the idea that you've heard me say a number of different times. This is one of those things, especially for the newer members, that I want you to I want you to digest and I want you to get. And that is this, that as it relates to growing our businesses, scaling our businesses, acquiring new customers at scale, that we are investors, right? We are investors. That's how I think about the money that we put into our media buying, our new customer acquisition. We are investors, and we're acquiring assets that have a present day value, a value today, and that have a future value. Those assets, of course, are customers, right? We're investors investing in the acquisition of customers. Another way to really think about this is that we are buying new customers, right? And that one kind of phrase right there should really impact your thinking, impact your perspective on a lot of different levels, whether you are new to the top one world or you've heard me say this in some form or fashion many times. This should always be kept out in front of you. We are buying new customers, and the way that we buy new customers, and you're going to understand like the nuance of this expression in just a second, but the way that we buy new customers, or where and how we buy new customers, of course, is our front end, right? Our front end. So that everybody understands, right? Everybody on the same page. The front end is all the marketing that we do with prospects to create that first transaction. It's what we do and how we do it to turn a non-buyer into a buyer for the first time in our world. Right.
And I want to add this to everybody, because Todd and I have had a lot of philosophical conversations about this. When we talk about front end, another way we like to put it is customer activation. And so a front end doesn't necessarily, right? If you have a list of 50,000 people who have never bought from you ever, and you decide to come up with an offer that you send to that list to get those people who have never bought from you ever to become customers, even though that's not paid traffic, even though they're on their list, that is essentially still a front end. Just to be clear, in terms of messaging, right? You're going to talk to those people differently than somebody who's bought from you time and again. This, of course, is going to be focused on paid front end, but I want to make sure you understand that, because that's an important differentiation. Just because somebody's on your list doesn't mean that when you try to get them to buy for the first time, that is now a back end offer.
Right. It's a great point. For what it's worth writing down, if for nothing else, in communication with your team. You know, the way that I look at it, the way that we look at it is like, look, when like what Damien said, you know, you got a list of prospects, a list of leads, a list of opt-ins, lead magnet requests, whatever you want to call it. When you are marketing to those individuals, right, you look at that as customer activation, right? You're turning that lead into a buyer. But the reality is that you've already paid for that lead. You've already paid to get the lead onto your list. And that's why, right, we call it customer activation, because we're turning that lead that we already paid for in another campaign into a buyer. When you are going straight from media buying to, like, when you're buying media and you're sending somebody straight to an offer, or even like, look, you're sending them to a lead capture page and then a self-liquidating offer right after that, and you're acquiring customers, that is customer acquisition. And so, right, when you have to, when you're acquiring customers and offsetting marketing costs, media buying costs, right, customer acquisition, when you've already paid for the lead and now you are attempting to turn them into a buyer, that is customer activation. Both are still considered the front end, because until somebody is a buyer, all they are is a lead. I just want you to understand again that, right, our front end is how and where we buy customers, right? And so the thing that I want you to understand, and one of the things that I want you to really grasp right now, if you've never pondered this or thought about this, especially the newer folks to the Top One World, is, right, the front end is limited. What I mean by that is the front end is a single transaction. The front end takes place one time. There's only one time when a prospect becomes a buyer. Now, look, you could certainly make the case that, well, what if they buy and then they don't purchase anything again from you for 3 years and then we want to reactivate them at some point? Put that complexity aside. When we're talking, for now, the front end, what we're talking about is a one-time occurrence. We make them, right, it's one transaction. It consists of a number of different products. It can consist of a number of different offers, but it's a one-time transaction that takes place that at that moment in time, call it, right, that lead now becomes a buyer. That lead now becomes a customer. That lead now becomes a client, whatever. That lead now becomes a patient, whatever it is that you want to call it. And then we've got the back end, and the back end is really the second transaction on, right? Depending on your business, it can be the second transaction, the third, the fourth, the fifth. It could go on into perpetuity, right? If you run a continuity business, like let's say Carl T, right? Every month, let's say if he sells a quarterly subscription, every quarter that re-ups, that person pays for their subscription, that is the back end. The first time he gets them to subscribe, that is the front end. But every time after that, that is the back end. Netflix, when they get a subscriber, right? You've got that first time when they turn somebody who's a non-subscriber into a subscriber, that's the front end. And then every month thereafter that they continue to pay for the service is the back end. And so,
can I add one thing in there, Todd?
sure.
And so it's important, again, this is another philosophical conversation that we've spent months on, really getting to a place that we go, this is clear, this is powerful, is when we also talk about front end, we really talk about in terms of calculating AOV, and front end really being what's part of the initial offer that's presented, right? If your initial offer is, you get this lesson and you can get the bump offer, and then 2 days later, you get a second chance at a bump offer. That's all part of the front end, right? That's all stuff you showed them the first time they came through the cash register, as opposed to if it's like, well, this is lesson A, and then a week later, you're like, hey, you can get lesson, B, C, D, E, and F. That's not part of the front end because they never knew that an offer existed. And so typically when we think about front end, we think about what did they see on their initial purchase. Even if they had a chance to buy it 24 hours, 48 hours later, it's still part of what they saw in that initial front end versus something they never knew existed, which really we like to classify, and we feel like is best classified as back end.
Yeah, and let me say this for what it's worth, and it's kind of, it's a great point, Damien. You're not even going to need to really know that so much for what I'm going to share with you in just a bit, but we get this question all the time, like, well, what's considered the front end? What's considered the back end? And what's considered, what's considered this and what's considered that? And should I cut it off at 3 days or 6 days or 5 days? And here's the thing that I want you to understand, very recently, and you'll see how this fits together. Very recently, and I think David Long can appreciate this, so, we've gone as a country in the United States, we've gone on this lockdown, as most countries have out there, right? And it started off where it was like this, shelter in place, stay at home, and it was all about social distancing and stay away from folks. And then you started to hear these stories of like guy is out in the middle of a lake on his boat, and somehow the police see the guy and the guy gets arrested because he's out on the boat in the middle of the lake and he's supposed to be at home. And now this guy's getting in trouble, even though he's out in the middle of the lake on a boat, no one's around, right? And that to me that's an example of when you start to live by the letter of the law instead of the spirit of the law. And what I mean by that is that, right, like that, all those regulations, all the rules were put in place to make sure that people are using social distancing. And now it's become like it's about the law. Like you said, you were supposed to be home. Right? The point being that in this context, it is like, look, don't get caught up in, there is no hard and fast rule of like, should you cut off what's considered the front end at 24 hours at 48 hours or whatever it may be. That's almost rather insignificant. What Damien was sharing is what we do. We consider anything that we show them in that initial transaction, whether they buy it right then and there or when we give them a second chance 24 or 48 hours later, we consider that the front end. For right now, what I want you to grasp from this slide, what I want you to just make sure that you recognize, you digest, and you understand is that the front end is a one-time occurrence that turns a prospect into a buyer. The back end is every other transaction that they participate in. So what that means, right? So what that means is that, right? The front end is what contributes to present value. So remember when I said, right, like that we are investors that are acquiring assets, just like Carl yesterday was talking about acquiring businesses, and those businesses have a value, or equities, right? You acquire a stock, it's got a value today, and then it's going to have some value in the future. With stocks, with equities, that value could be zero. It could be quadruple, 10 times what it is today. We don't know until we get there. Very different from our world because we are able to know what the future value of a customer is. Not necessarily with certainty, but certainly with a level of accuracy. The front end, right, is what tells us the present value of a customer. The back end is the future value, right? All of this you guys should understand. This is somewhat a recap of what you've heard me say 12 times in top one, right? What I want you to now start to narrow this down is this. The front end and the present value is just about customer acquisition. It's just about customer acquisition. The back end and the future value, right? So the back end, the second, third, fourth, fifth transaction and on, right? And the future value, all of that makes up the real business that we're in. And what I mean by that is that, right, like the back end is what we really want to provide, are the offers that we really want to bring to the marketplace, are the bundles, the packages that we really want to give to the marketplace. The front end is just there to acquire customers. It's just there to acquire customers. All the bundles that we put together, the offers that we assemble, everything that we bring to the marketplace, the ideas, even the type of campaigns that we bring to the marketplace are there for one reason and one reason only, and that is customer acquisition. Or said differently now within this context, right? Within this context is the front end, all about, right, the front end, which is present value, all about customer acquisition, is all about getting the asset. That is it. Now listen to me. This should be a slight little shift. It's all about getting the asset. It's not making money from the asset. It's not profiting from the asset. It's not leveraging the asset, right? It's not multiplying. It's getting the asset. That's what we're trying to do as investors with our front end. We are trying to get the asset. The back end is where we profit from the asset, right? So you see how I said the back end is really the business that we are in. The front end, to some extent, you could look at it as a necessary evil, that it's what we need to do to be able to acquire customers, right? And we operate, as you guys and gals understand, we operate different from the typical mom and pop, the typical brick and mortar business, right? The typical brick and mortar business looks at every transaction the same. They're very transactionally minded, right? Every transaction is there with the typical mom and pop for the same purpose, the same reason, with the same objective, looking for the same margin, the same everything. We know better. And we know that the front end is all about customer acquisition, is all about getting the asset. And you're going to understand what that means in terms of how do we get the asset using present value? How do we get the asset using present value? That is all it's there for, to get the asset. And then let the back end give us the profit from that asset, right? And so with that now as the backdrop, the big question, or the first question in this whole kind of chain of thinking becomes, well, then how much should we pay for this asset? right? Just like you would do with a business, just like Adam and Carl talked about yesterday with a business, right? Just like when it comes to buying a home as an investment property or an equity, right? How much should you pay for that asset? Now, I want to show you how we think about this, and I'm going to start to put everything through the filter of our flywheel, which Damien showed you. This is the original kind of ugly version of the flywheel, if you will. But this is This is our flywheel that you saw yesterday. Generate buyers, conversations with sales teams, sell E5, superior client results, outstanding marketplace reputation. This is the flywheel. So I'm going to start to show you how we determine what we should pay for an asset, and then how we optimize those campaigns with certain levers in just a bit, right? So now we've got everything that I've showed you up to this point, right? And we've got our flywheel alongside. And so what I want you to understand is that for us, right, that front end, that customer acquisition is generate new buyers. Generate new buyers. Okay, right? Simple, everybody, nothing new, nothing revolutionary here, right? That's our quote unquote, that's like 90% of our front end. We're not doing lead gen. We're not doing lead magnet type of things. We might have one or two campaigns that we've run that the team plays around with over the last 2, maybe 3 years. What we're typically doing, or the most part, is we're driving to a variety of different offers. Now, what I want you to understand is that to begin to understand present value, to begin to understand and do the math here, we've got two sides to this equation. We've got the cost. What does it actually cost us to generate a buyer, right? And that cost, in our world, in our direct response marketing world, is called the CPA, the cost per acquisition. What does it cost us to acquire a customer? What is the cost to us per customer acquisition? Meaning, what does it cost us to acquire a single new customer? That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is the revenue, right? The revenue. In this context, that revenue is what we call AOV, average order value. It's the average amount of money that a customer spends when they go through our campaign. Very simple, very straightforward, right? Nothing new for you guys here. So one side of the equation, what is the cost per acquisition? Other side of the equation, AOV. Now remember, what you're seeing right here is that AOV, average order value, is what that customer is worth on average today, present value. We're talking now, we're in the realm here of present value, right? So remember, under the front end, right, we said that it was present value. And so in order to determine present value, we're looking at AOV, and we're looking at the cost to get the customer, and the value of that customer right then and there.
And I have to ask the question, because we've talked about it before, and I think I know we're going to be on the same page on this finally, which is, so we sell a product, a front end product. It's, hey, buy this new audio course, whatever, and it's a 2-pay.
Yeah.
It's a 2-pay. First payment now, next payment 30 days.
Yeah.
We're only counting day one payment for our AOV.
Yeah,
right?
that's yes, because now look, this is one of those things where I said letter of the law, spirit of the law, right? You got to I don't believe look, there is not one right answer, right? Because I've seen obviously lots of businesses, and I've seen businesses calculate it. You can calculate it a lot of different ways. It's just like accounting, man. It's a very subjective endeavor. But I would tell you that it is very risky to start to include future payments into your AOV, because you are floating the cash for the future payment. So I don't want to know what's coming in a month or 2 months or 3 months or 4 months, because the reality is this, right? And certainly we all know this. Adam could give you the math behind this if we even need it, right? But the reality is, look, you could make a lot of sales that way, and your numbers, your AOV, the way you're calculating it, could look great. And man, on the books, you could have a ton of sales, but you could go out of business because you run out of cash, right? Because what looks like you're acquiring customers at a profit, let's say, isn't really at a profit at all. It's really at a loss, and you run out of money before you get a chance to collect that. So no, when we sell a 2-pay, a 3-pay, a 4-pay, we don't look at the second, third, fourth. We're looking at, again, and this is why I use this language specifically, present value. That's the value today. That's the value at acquisition, right? Or
Yeah.
activate, right? It's not future value, it's present value.
And the significance of this is, think about it, right? When we're acquiring customers, right? Because the tendency is to go, well, it's a to pay on my front end product, therefore it's all front end revenue. But the point is, when we get to that AOV number, we're going to use that AOV number to determine maximum allowable customer aggression.
I'm going to
Right?
get there. Yeah, I'm going to
Right.
get there.
And I just want to make the point to make sure that everybody understands that if we go, well, it's a 3 pay and we get more money in 30 days and in other days in 60 days, and you build your whole strategy around that, you can end up burning cash at a speed that you cannot replenish it. And so I just want you to keep in mind, I don't want to steal any, give any spoilers of what's coming, but just important for that to remember that.
Yeah. And here's where things start to, right? Everything up to this point, for those of you that have been around direct response, certainly our world for any significant length of time, have heard me share this in some form or fashion. Here's where it starts to take the turn. And I don't mean changed, but it's just been the way I think about it, the way we process, the way we look at it is a little bit simpler than the way we used to look at it before. So obviously you got your cost and you got your revenue, you got your CPA and you got your AOV. Well, the difference between those two is what we call the investment, right? So the difference between those two is what we call the investment. You've got a CPA, you've got a cost, and you've got revenue. And remember, the question that we started this session off with was, what are you willing, right? Like, what are you willing to pay to acquire 1,000 customers? Really, a better question would have been, what are you willing to invest to get 1,000 customers, right? Because this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about, right, the difference between these two is your investment necessary to acquire a customer. So let's say, for example, that you had a CPA of $85. That means that it costs you $85 to acquire a new customer. Right? Meaning, call it, you spent $850 on a Facebook traffic campaign, on a Facebook ad campaign, and you acquired 10 new customers. Well, if you spent $850 and you acquired 10 new customers, that means you had a CPA of 85. The $850 that you spent, the cost divided by the total number of new customers, gives you an $85 CPA. Let's say you had a $30 AOV. That means on average, every customer spent $30 with you going through the campaign. Right? I mean, some could have spent $7 with you. Some could have spent $90 with you. Call it for argument's sake. On average, the average customer spent $30. Well, that means that the investment to get a customer here is $55, right? Our investment is $55 to get this customer. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, like, is that good? Is that a good number for you? Is that allowable? Is that okay? What does that mean? Does that make you profitable? Is that going to lead you to go out of business? Like, what does that mean? But for right now, I just want you to understand that's how we look at it. The difference between the CPA and the AOV is our investment. Is it a good investment or is it a bad investment? That's all I ask myself. Right? You see, this is very different than the way the typical marketer, the typical entrepreneur is thinking about things, because the way that they're thinking about their traffic, even some of the more quote unquote advanced guys, what they're thinking about, they're thinking about, like, how much, for every dollar that I put in, how much do I get back? And, like, right, how much do I want to get back? And they're right. I'm just thinking to myself, like, is this a good investment? Right? In other words, just think about this for 1 second. Right? See how this simplified things. Is this a good investment for me in my business, right? To pay $55 to acquire a customer, to acquire a buyer, knowing what I know. And we're going to break this down, knowing what I know about my business, knowing what I know about the back end, knowing what I know about the conversion rate on those offers, knowing what I know about the price point on those offers, knowing what I know about what happens next. Is this a good investment for me? Should I be willing to spend $55 to get a customer? I'm going to show you how we make that determination and all that, and different scenarios in just a second, right? But when you start to think of it that way, you start to realize, right, that I'm an investor. I'm acquiring assets. Those assets have a present day value, right? And that present day value is AOV, right? That AOV helps me subsidize the cost to acquire that asset. That's all. That's the only way that I look at it. Let me say that again. That AOV helps me as an investor subsidize the cost for acquiring that asset, that customer. Right? Kind of like it's almost like a way of looking at, like, where it is, imagine that you've gotten a loan from the bank or a partner that you don't need to pay back. right, to acquire that asset. So like when Carl was talking yesterday about, right, acquiring businesses and getting a loan or getting an investor or something like that, or doing owner, seller financing, right? Imagine that we're getting money as a loan that we do not need to pay back. And that money is there to subsidize the acquisition of an asset, right? That money that we're getting today, right, is the value today, is the AOV. That's what we're getting today. And we're using that AOV, that value today, to offset the cost of that asset. So, right, if we didn't have that AOV, if we didn't have that present value, if the present value to us was zero, we would be paying $85 to get that asset, right? Like we would be paying $85 to get that asset. But now, thanks to our AOV, thanks to that present day value, right, we've subsidized a bit of the cost of that acquisition of that asset. And so now it only costs us $55 out of pocket to get that asset. Now, look, when you are acquiring any asset, if you are acquiring fine art, if you're acquiring precious metal, right? You're always going out of pocket to get the asset based on future value. You're always going, right, in some form or fashion, you're always making an investment, right, to get the asset based on the future value. That is the way that we are thinking about it. So in my world, in our world, am I willing, like, is that good? Should I be willing to make a $55 investment to get this asset known as a customer in our world based on what I know about the future value? Right. So that's what we're talking about. You're going to see, I'm going to show you, have no fear. We're going to get to numbers in just a couple minutes. Right. And so that's the front end. And so, right, we know, like in that example, just with that CPA and with that AOV, we know that we're making an investment of $55. Now, I want you to understand, that is an investment of $55 to acquire a single new customer. If we acquire 1,000 new customers, that's $55,000. Right? If we acquire 100 new customers, that's $5,500. So this is per customer that we're talking about. We are paying $55 to acquire a single asset, that asset being one customer. Well, now that's the front end. Now we get to the back end. And the back end is sell E5. If you look over at our flywheel, right, that is the second part where we generate money. Generate buyers is the first lever where we generate money. Sell E5 is the second lever where we generate money. In between, this is really a marketing thing. We need to generate calls with salespeople in order to really make this happen. But the front end, generate buyers, and sell E5 are the two levers that produce revenue for us. And so sell E5 is the back end. Now, so you understand, right? Sell E5, right? So we're talking about people are coming in on the front end. When we generate buyers, that's where those people are coming from. Those people are coming in from our front end. We talked about present value. We talked about the investment, all that stuff, right? We said investment is $55. Then we are selling E5, right? There are a certain number of people that come in on that front end. There are a certain number of those assets that we paid $55 for that then go on to buy E5. Now, right, is this is this already just looking at this one couple numbers, right? Like, well, we need to know a couple more numbers to know really what's going on, to understand, like, can we afford 55? Should we pay 65? Should we only pay 25? What should we be willing to pay? There are two additional numbers that we obviously need to know. And one is, what's the price? In this case, the price of E5. What's the price of the thing that we are now selling? And in this case, what I want you to think about is, this is the second transaction. You see where it says 2, 3, 4, right? Under front end, it said 1. That's because that was the first transaction. Under the back end, it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 into, perpetuity. Here, right here, for us, right now, what I'm talking about is the second transaction, okay? Second transaction, E5. In order to know whether this is a good investment or not, like whether we're making the right investment, we're under-investing, we're over-investing, we need to know two things. What's the price of E5? And what's the second thing you think we need to know? Who could be the first one to pop into the chat? What is the second number that we need to know besides price?
Conversion
So price, rate. What was that, Carl?
Conversion rate.
You got it. Conversion rate. Absolutely. Price and conversion rate. We need to know price and conversion rate. So let's take, and this is why, let me take a step back for 1 second and just say this. You've heard me say before, right, that the beauty of this business, the beauty of direct response, having a direct response driven business is this, that we get to make decisions that are objective, not subjective. Subjective decisions are decisions based on my opinion, Damien's opinion, Teddy's opinion, John's opinion, my assumptions, his beliefs, my beliefs, what he likes, what I like, right? All that stuff is worthless, right? Because I have no, when it's subjective, it's based on whims, it's based on perspective, it's based on filters, right? The beauty is that in direct response, we get to make decisions objectively. That means it's based on numbers, it's based on data, right? And to the best of your ability, you always want to let the data drive your decisions. You want to let the data inform your decision making. And so one of the things that you've heard me say many times before is that why I push our clients to launch a new campaign as quickly as possible as a minimum viable funnel, right? As quickly as possible as a minimum viable funnel is because we want to go from subjective decision-making to objective decision-making as quickly as we can. The more that they're editing and tweaking and changing things, the more that you are editing and tweaking and changing things before you've released it to the world and gotten data, the more you're making just subjective decisions or decisions based on subjective, subjectivity. And so you want to go out, get numbers as quickly as you can so that you go from subjective decision-making to objective decision-making. So you should have numbers here for your campaign. You should know, what does it cost me to acquire a customer, right? What is the average customer worth right now? What is the price that I'm charging right now? And what is the conversion rate right now? We want to start off with base level numbers. You can't steer a stationary object, right? You can't you can't improve, you can't improve a book until the book is first written, right? You can't optimize a campaign until the campaign is created, launched, and we've got data to understand what the heck is going on. And so over here in our world, what we're talking about is this: price, $6,800, which is for the E5 coaching program, right? So 6,800 and roughly a 2% sales conversion rate. Okay, roughly a 2% sales conversion rate. That is right. That is us turning 2% of our, call it 2% of our buyers into E5 coaching students. So now you've got these numbers. And so now all of this has been leading up to what I'm going to show you 2 slides from now, or walk you through two slides from now. And that is this. So we've got these numbers, right? We've got a CPA. What did we say it was? It was $85 for the CPA. We said we've got an AOV that was, what did I say? 30, right? We've got a total investment per customer of 55. We've got 2% of those buyers that now buy a $6,800 program. So here's the question: to optimize, right? To optimize this bad boy, which lever should we pull? Because there are, and this is key, right? This is the goods. This is what Damien really loves so much, as a guy who loves to focus the team and really laser, get folks lasered in. It's right. There are so many levers that you could pull. Now, mind you, understand, this is still directly connected to our flywheel, right? We are talking, this is directly connected to our flywheel. So now we're in the machine, right? To optimize, which do we pull? Because there are a number of levers that we can focus on. Do we try to decrease the CPA, right? So do we try to get the CPA from 85 down to 75? Do we try to get it down to 65? Do we try to get it down to 55? And getting it down, just so that in this context you understand, getting the CPA down really involves one of 2 things. It involves either getting cheaper clicks, call it, right, for lack of a better phrase, or increasing our sales conversion rate, right? Decreasing our cost per click or increasing our sales conversion rate. Do we increase AOV? Right now, look, understand that increasing AOV, you've heard me talk about this before, right? Increasing AOV is certainly infinitely easier than increasing sales conversion rate, right? Enough to radically impact the golden ratio, which we talked about in January. And for those new members, if you send Glenda a note, I believe that we can get you a copy of my presentation from that on this golden ratio, right? But we've got increasing AOV. It's another lever that we can pull in that whole equation. We can increase the price, right? That's going to impact the math, and you're going to see this in just a second. We can increase the back end sales conversion. That's that 2% conversion rate of customers into E5 buyers. The question is, right, like, which lever do we pull, right? The answer is there's not always just one answer or one lever across the board for everybody. Meaning I can't sit here and say to you, increase your price, or I can't sit here and say to you, for all of you, it is increase your back end sales conversion rate per se, right? We run scenarios, right? We run simple scenarios. And so I want to pull this up for you. I'm going to turn my camera off, and I want to pull this up for you. And I want to walk you through some of these 6 scenarios that were the final 6 scenarios that Damian and I discussed. That, let me see this. Let's do this. Just 1 second. Tell me, Damian, give me a thumbs up that you can see these scenarios on the virtual whiteboard. Cool. Awesome. Okay. So I want you to look at this, and I want you to stay with me as I am walking you through this. So don't skip ahead and start to make a decision about, things that I'm going to get to this. So the very first thing, right? And this is one of those things like where Adam is probably looking at this and he's probably, vomiting in his mouth thinking like, right, he's probably looking to bring up an Excel sheet, whatnot. I'm a non-financial guy. I like to keep things simple, right? These are things, this is what I was sending Damian. Like sending him in Slack, or was it Slack, Damian? Yeah, it was Slack.
Yeah. It was spontaneous. There was no meeting time.
I was like, man, I've been digging into some of the numbers, oddball, right? And so let's look at this. So let's look at scenario number 1 over here. So, let's just look across the board. So these scenarios across the board, number 1, this is a scenario where we're looking at where we just started. $85 cost per acquisition and a $30 average order value. Then I wanted to see, well, what happens if we go up to $150 CPA and we get it up to $65 AOV? And you could see different numbers over here, 120 CPA, 85, right? And now look, these are based on rough numbers that we already collected from running campaigns, right? So again, we weren't just pulling these out of the air. We were pulling these from campaigns that we had run. Now, the thing that I want you to understand is this, first and foremost. So CPA, AOV, CPA, AOV, CPA, AOV, right? 2 really important things that I want you to understand. Number 1 is this. In these scenarios where you've got a higher AOV, like let's take this guy and this guy over here and compare it to this guy over here. What I want you to understand is that this is going to require a different price point core product, right? Like the reality is that your AOV, it really informs your decision-making on your pricing, right? Because if this AOV was, call it $200, well, what is the likelihood of me starting off with a $7, quote unquote, tripwire product and getting to a $200 AOV? Like, what's the likelihood of me doing that, right? The likelihood of doing that is very slim, right? And so the point is that the higher the AOV, right, call it, to keep things real simple, the higher the core price of the higher the price of the core offer, right? And so I immediately start to look at things like, all right, like this is 30, right? So if we like this scenario, we could make this work with a low ticket product over here, right? We could make this work with a low ticket product. Over here, right, we would require a bit of a higher ticket product in order to make that work. And so that's the first thing that I want you to understand, that the AOV is going to inform your pricing. Now, at the same time, you have to be honest with yourself when you start running scenarios and you see like, man, all right, we're selling a $7 product and we ran a scenario and the scenario works as long as we have an AOV of 120, man, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? You're playing a game that is going to be difficult to win, right? I always tell Damian, like, look, I want to go into campaigns where it's easy to win. Like economically, even if this thing does terrible, like we're still gonna, right? Like it's kind of like this, you know, it's like, I love what, and again, this is, you know, an Adam or a Carl thing, you know, I love the idea of like, you know, like Warren Buffett, or there's a guy, Phil Town, who's like a value investor dude. And he always talks about like, you know, like you want to be able to make money, even in the absolute worst case scenario, when you invest in a business, even if that business goes out of business, and it has to liquidate everything. If it liquidated all of its assets, you would get your money back kind of proposition, right? Like I want to put myself in a game that I can win. And so you've just got to be honest with yourself as it relates to the AOV, like, and what you are charging. Second thing that I want you to understand is this. Let's look at this. Let's look at this campaign over here, right? This campaign over here, and from a CPA perspective, and let's look at this campaign over here. Now, which of these campaigns are easier to make work? Which CPA would you say is easier to make work? Somebody, is this is, call it scenario 1. This is scenario 2. Which scenario 2? George said scenario 2. Why? Adam said scenario 2. Why?
Because it's easier to buy a customer if you can pay more than everybody else.
There
right?
you go. That's it. Right? Like, and so think about it simply like this, right? Like, look, if you're the investor, right, and you're willing to pay $150 for an asset, and every other investor is only willing to pay $85 for an asset, it's going to be easier for you to acquire assets. And so, right, so the thing that I want you to understand is this, that the higher the CPA in your scenario that works, and this is, listen to me carefully, right? The higher the CPA in your scenario that works, the safer it is, the safer for you it is. I said to Damien, I said, look, man, like I love the idea of $150 CPA and potentially making it work. I love that, right? Why? Because what are the odds on us getting to a point where media increases to the point where we can't acquire a customer for $150? But now you start to look at 85, and right, you could say that for us, we've certainly had campaigns where the CPA creeped above $85. And so, right, this makes our business much more vulnerable than going with a scenario of 150, right? If we can make it work with, and that's what I want you to understand. If I could make the investment work paying $150, right, then I am excited. Right? Because it gives me a lot more opportunity. There are a lot more buys. There are a lot more things that I can do at that CPA than at this CPA. Now, so the next thing that I want you to look at over here.
Maria and Peter asked a great question. In terms of AOV, the typical rule of thumb we use is that your main offer should only, ideally, when your passive minimum viable funnel, should only account for 40% of your overall AOV, meaning that if you're selling a $40 product, your overall AOV should be about $100.
Yeah.
If not, you're leaving money on the table. That's a good sort of bar or benchmark. Now, Greg messaged in. He's killing it with his book. He's got a $10 book and a $44 AOV, which is crushing. And obviously, the lower the front end price, the more that multiple will be on AOV. But that's a good rule of thumb to use.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so here is now what I want you to look at, right? So in every scenario, right, every one of these, we use these numbers to do what? We use these numbers to now look at what is our investment, right? And so remember, we're talking about investing in the acquisition of an asset. In this case, that asset is a single customer. Now, the thing that I want you to know, right, like over here, like is 55 good? Is 85 good? Is, you know, like in these different scenarios, right? We're going to get there. But the thing that I just want you to understand, right, we then look at this on a 1,000 customer basis. So all we do is, right, we're just looking at, all right, well, would we pay 55,000? Would we go 55? Now this is 55,000 out of pocket. This is 55,000 that goes out of the bank account. In this one, 85, 35, 50, 20, right, 85 over here, out of pocket, right? Now, the thing that I want you to understand, and you can see this from these different scenarios, like if you look at this one and you compare it to this one, right, still same 1,000 buyers, same 1,000 buyers, right? It's interesting, right? That this is 20,000 out of pocket. This is 85,000 out of pocket. And the thing for you to understand is, right, that obviously the higher the investment, the greater it impacts your cash flow. Some of you may not be able to do this right over here. Some of you may be, you jump through, crazy hoops to do this, right? And so I routinely say, well, are we willing to invest, 20,000, 50,000, 35,000 to get 1,000 new customers? Then what we do is we take this number, we take these different scenarios, right? And excuse me, and then we look at, well, all right, so if we continue to convert at 2%, over here we said, well, what happens if we focus on 3%? What happens if it drops down a little bit? What happens if we increase it a little bit, right? What happens to the total quantity of back-end buyers? And that's when it says 20 buyers, we're talking about E5 buyers, right? So this is 20, this is 20, 20. Over here, you can see 30, 17, 22. And then, of course, what I'm doing over here is I'm looking at the back-end revenue, right? So in this case, we got 30 E5 buyers. 30 E5 buyers at 6,800 is 204,000. Over here, right, we generated 17%, 17 buyers at 6,800 is 115,000. And so you can see these numbers over here, okay? Now, in our calculation, right, I just take into account sales commission using like an average sales commission for our team, right? So average sales commission over here, over here, over here. And then what I do is just at the very bottom is I take our total revenue generated by the back end, right? So see how I'm looking at this as an investment. I looked at, right, we generated $136,000 by turning these 20 buyers into E5 buyers over here. But then I have to subtract the investment that I made to acquire the initial assets, right? So you could say, for argument's sake, that we generated $136,000 from these $136,000 of additional money from these 1,000 buyers by turning 20 of them into E5 buyers. So we have 136,000 minus the $55,000 investment that we had to make, minus the commission, and that leaves us with 56,520 in, call it net profit, call it profit. And so that's where this number comes from. This number right here is 41% of this number. And so now we're able to see different scenarios, right? Like, I said to Damien, like in this scenario over here, right? We took 55 grand. We took a $55,000 investment and really we turned it into $56,000 of profit. Over here, we took, call it an $85,000 investment, and we turned it into $26,000 of profit. Over here, right, $35,000 investment, $76,000 of profit. So you can start to make decisions about this. Just looking at, like, you could start to see which is a great investment, or a better investment. 50 grand turned it into 72,000, 20 grand turned it into $74,000 of profit, 85 grand turned it into 82 grand of profit. You could just start to see the margin over here. But the last thing that I just want to show, and then Damien, if there's anything that you want to, any questions that you want me to address from folks, is this, right? Then what it does when you have these scenarios, and how we call it, started with this scenario, right? And then from this, we go over here and we say, all right, well, what happens if we increase our CPA, right? Like, what happens if we go from an $85 CPA and we're willing to spend, $150, and right, like, so we're willing to spend more right now, which it's really just a decision if you're willing to spend more. But now what we do is we work on AOV. And so we leave everything else the same, but we work on AOV. And so we bring our CPA up to max, like maximum, which gives us a buffer. And And right. And then, okay, well, what happens? That's what happens. So that's what happens if we work on AOV, if we allow the CPA to creep up, because we know, let's say, or we believe that this CPA is too low. Over here, what happens if we are able to get we only allow our CPA to go up to 120, and we get our AOV way up, in this case, from $30 to, call it, $85. What happens? And nothing else changes over here, right? And we start to just play around with different scenarios, like, right, you could take this scenario and you could leave it the same, and you could say, well, what happens if we leave this the same, right? We don't work on AOV. Instead of working on AOV, we work on our back-end conversion, and we're able to bring this from, 2% to 2.2%. Or 2% to 3%. Now you have to understand something, right? Like, I want to be crystal clear. If you have a 1% sales conversion and you increase that to 2%, if you have a 1% sales conversion and you increase it to 2%, you didn't increase it by 1%, you doubled it. And so you just have to be clear on the work, right? Like, you didn't increase it by 1%, you doubled it. And so when I say go from 2% to 3%, I don't want you to think that that's a 1% increase. That's a significant jump in conversion, right? But I want you to understand, I want you to start to look at, well, what happens to our numbers when we work on this number over here, right? What happens if we work on this number? Like, are we better off, are we better off raising the AOV? Or let's say this, are we better off trying to decrease CPA, right, by $10? Let's just say we decrease it by $10 over here, right? Like, what happens? Then we actually will run the number. We'll run the number, and you can already see, well, if we worked on this, right, and what's it going to take for us to decrease the CPA by $10 or $20? Let's say we decrease the CPA by $10. So this comes down to 25 over here, right? 25. And so this becomes, right, $25,000. This is $25,000. And so all we did was we swung this by 10 grand over here, is all we did by working on getting the CPA down by $10. But if we got this number from, call it, let's just say, for argument's sake, to keep the math real simple, from 2% to 3%, right? Now this becomes 30 buyers. This is 30 buyers over here. And so what is that? That's another $68,000 over here. That's another 68,000. So by focusing on this bad boy instead of this bad boy over here, right? By focusing here, we only swung this number by 10 grand. By focusing over here, we swung the number by 68 grand. You see what I'm saying? And so it gives you the ability to see, like, what lever you should focus on. And it's all through the lens of what's the investment that we're willing to make? How much am I willing to make to get 1,000 buyers? And so I'm sharing that with you guys and gals here, because I really just want you to do 3 things. And then Damien will take questions. Number 1, I want you to calculate what you're willing to invest to get 1,000 new customers, right? What is the number? Is it 10 grand? Is it 20 grand? Is it 30 grand? Is it 3 grand? Is it 1,000? This is obviously dependent on 2 things, right? It's dependent on you knowing what a customer is worth, right? And it's dependent on having the cash to invest. If you've got zero cash, zero cash flow, well, then you're not going to be able to make this kind of investment. But calculate what you're willing to invest to get 1,000 new customers, or I should say the number is going to be substantially lower. Review at least 6 different scenarios. We reviewed a lot more than 6 different scenarios and dumped a bunch, and then came back to those core. And then choose your target scenario. That's it, right? Calculate what you're willing to invest to get 1,000 new customers, review 6 different scenarios, and then choose your target scenario. Of course, your business may be different, right? And some businesses are more complicated than others. That's okay. You can still run scenarios like I just shared. And so let me see here. So Carl said, when you are investing in a negative ROI on the front end, which is exactly what we're doing, right? It's just a different way of looking at it, right? Instead of, right, it's going from like this complex idea of like, right, I'm going to go negative on the front, and instead what are you willing to invest to acquire an asset that has value? on the front end. What's your time frame to profit? 30 days, 60 days, or is it different? So in this particular scenario, it's within 30 days for us. And so using this now, if we've got a a different business model will obviously be wildly different. Like, right, at AF, it's certainly, at AF, 6 months. I've had, I've worked with some of the Agora divisions that were 3 months. There are some divisions that, like, let's say on a lead, they're willing to go 12 months before it really, and so there you go. Lindsay said 60, 90 on another, right? I think that the scenario, it depends on the business, right? It depends on cash. For us, we're able to go, we are able to recoup our ad spend in the first 30 days with that campaign. And you could see the reason why, right? We're selling a $6,800 product. And so it's not that difficult. You don't have to sell that many $6,800 products to recoup that. The other thing that this does, this does, right, is you want to be careful. And Teddy has pointed this out a number of different times. Like, Teddy is the guy who's constantly the voice in the wilderness screaming this out, so to speak. Like, if you look at this scenario over here, I like looking at it like this because it ensures that you're not using too much of your lifetime value to subsidize the cost to acquire a customer, right? Like, if you look at this over here, this bad boy, right? We're laying out $85,000 to get 1,000 buyers, right? And in this scenario, and then based on, selling them, E5, right? Focusing on E5, our core baby, right? We're only kind of quote unquote netting out 26,000. Like, is that a scenario that we want to operate within? Do we want to operate within this scenario where, like, out of that, again, out of $136,000, right? We took $100,000, over $100,000 that had to be, like, used to generate that 136. That's really the way that I look at it, right? It's the efficiency of that money. In that example, right, out of this 136,000, it took us, call it $105,000 or $110,000 of this just to produce a $26,000 profit. And so it's the way that we kind of ensure, like, man, like, we don't want to make an $85,000 investment, go through all this to just bank $26,000. Because at the end of the day, right, like Teddy would always say, is like, man, we're just eating into lifetime value so much. And so hope that makes sense. Let me see. Are all those CPA AOV combo stats from the same offer or different offers? These are all just scenarios. So what we're doing here is we're taking, call it for lack of a better phrase, let's say that we're taking where we're starting, right? Like, let's say this is where we're at right now. And I'm trying to see, well, in different scenarios, and how I got to these 6, I don't even remember, but right, I'm trying to see what would happen, right, if we focus on like, if we allow our CPA to go up to 150, but we increase our AOV. Right? Like, if we work on our AOV, so we're not worried about this. Like, nobody on the team is trying to crank up, trying to crank up, this conversion rate over here. Nobody's thinking about the price point over here. Nobody's, like, we didn't focus on any of that. All we focused on was this. How would it play out? What would it do to the numbers? Right? And so, and we start to say, like, we're at a $30 AOV. Over here in this example, let's just say, right, we're looking at a $100 AOV. What is the likelihood? What's the time frame that it's going to take for us to go from a $30 AOV to a $100 AOV? What is it going to take? How are we going to make that happen? Like, what is the likelihood of us making that happen in a reasonable amount of time? I know I always like the higher CPA, right? And this is based on, like, this is low end. For this campaign that we're talking about, this is high end, right? So this is low end, this is high end. If I had to choose between these two, I'd rather be somewhere over here. right? Because I want to be able to pay high, right? And so now I start to look at, well, to pay the high CPA, to pay, let's say 120, 150, these guys, right? Like, well, what is it going to take? What is it going to take to make this work? Well, in this example, right, like, all right, this is a terrible scenario because we pay $85,000 and we only bank 26 grand. All right, so something needs to change over here. Maybe it's that, let's say over here. Well, what if we go from here to here, right? In these two examples over here, nothing changed except this, except we worked on the conversion. Look at the difference between the two. Over here, right, we still made the same $85,000 investment to get those 1,000 customers. But over here, if we can focus our time, energy, and effort converting 3% instead of 2%, the difference is from 26 grand netted out to 82 grand netted out, right? Like, and that's, you know, you see the difference over here, right? You were paying more, obviously, in commission, but just by moving this from 2% to 3%, look at the swing over here. And so, right, what's the likelihood of us being able to move this from 2% to 3% versus what's the likelihood of us, let's say, being able to go from 65 to call it, 100 over here. And so there you go. And so, Damien, I know that it looks like there are a bunch of questions coming in and a bunch of stuff. And so that's it for me. I'm not sure if you had some questions that you wanted to cover now. I know we're about 15 minutes over. You let me know.
I'm going to continue answering some questions in the chat. But yeah, this is just so important for everybody to really understand this math. Was something I wanted to chime in a little bit earlier, Todd, is that so often, again, you know, I lead our coaching calls a lot of times, even inside of Top One, and I get these questions all the time. It's like, hey, I'm getting a 2-time ROI on this campaign. Like, what would you do to increase conversion rate or increase AOV? And it's like, it's not asking the right questions, right? If you have a campaign that on the front end is in the black, the question needs to be, how do I increase the overall volume, even if that means decreasing the profit on the front end, because that vehicle is there for customer acquisition. And so for somebody that, you know, if you ask most entrepreneurs, they would not get this question right, at least as we see it in the way to scale a direct response business. If I said, hey, you know, you could either run $1,000 a day at a 200% ROI, or you could run $2,000 a day at break even. Most people would say, oh, I'll run the $1,000 a day at the higher ROI, not realizing that the whole reason the front end exists is to get maximum customer acquisition. If you're making decisions on your front end based upon trying to extract maximum profit out of your front end, you're missing the point of your front end strategy.
Yeah. So Chris, like if you're saying, right, like this is what I would tell you, right? You're breaking even at $69 and you don't have a bump. Let's say for argument's sake, let's keep it real simple and say you don't have a bump, you don't have an upsell, you don't have a downsell, you just have a core product that you're selling at $69 and you're breaking even. So you have a CPA of 69, you have an AOV of 69. Well, I would tell you to still add in the bump and the upsell, because if you can get the AOV from 69 to 109 and you're still willing to break even, which obviously I know you are, then you could afford to spend 109 to get a customer. Would you rather be able to spend 109 to get a customer or 69 to spend to get a customer? And so, right, like that's right, like Damien said, and this is a subtle point, but it's an important point, right? Your aim is maximum customer acquisition. That's why I said on the front end, if you go back, everything that I shared in this presentation was obviously there for a reason. I said the front end is all about getting the asset. And so, you know, the beauty of what we do compared to acquiring equities, right, is that I don't know what I believe the equity is going to be worth XYZ in 6 months, but I don't know. We have a much more accurate prediction of what our customers are going to be worth to us in a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and so on. And so I want to acquire the maximum number of assets that I possibly can, knowing, like, look, that's why I said, would I spend 85 grand? Knowing what it is that we've got going on right here, like, would I spend 85 grand to get 1,000 customers? That's one of those questions for you to really just ask yourself. Don't be careful that you're not getting into the weeds and like, would you spend 85 grand to get 1,000 customers? right? Knowing what you know about your business, about the back end, about the offer that you're going to make to them first, second, third, about the conversion rate, right? Like assuming that there's no black swan events, no anomalies, no weird traffic sources, you know, would you spend 85,000 to acquire 1,000 customers? I'm curious, just out of curiosity, Carl, would you spend 85 grand to acquire 1,000 buyers?
Me or Carl Trent?
You.
Me, absolutely. If I could monetize that within 30 to 60 days, absolutely.
Yeah, right? Like, I mean, and like, yeah.
I'd spend $1 million because it's Adam's money now, not mine.
That's right. That changes everything. That's a different presentation for later. I like that. There you go. Right. And that's like, Greg, would you spend 20,000 to acquire 1,000 customers?
All day.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yeah. Like all day, every day. Right now, there's a certain number where, like, look, what's interesting, right? Like, what's really interesting is, just for what it's worth, Damien, right? Like, it's interesting because the higher the number that you get, the more, I should really say, the less objective your thinking becomes, the less it becomes about the math. And then what starts to creep in is this fear of like, ooh, geez, as long as nothing goes wrong and I don't botch it, right? At 10,000, you're like, everything's going to be great, of course, all day long, because you're thinking just math. You're thinking in, out, in, right? But the reality is it's the same way, it's the same way that Carl looks at and Adam looks at investing in a business. It's the same way that, that a real estate investor is looking at real estate. It's the same way that you're looking at an equity. We're investors, man. We're just investing in the acquisition of assets. And so you've just got to recognize that it's math, man. That's all it is. It is mathematical. And does it make mathematical sense? And that's one of the reasons why I just love direct response, because it's all math, right? Forget the communication and psychology, right? We know that it's, psychology, communication, and arithmetic. Put that stuff aside. That's the fun stuff. That's the persuasion stuff. That's the offer stuff, right? I'm talking about that when it comes to the arithmetic, it's all numbers, right? It's all like, and so for us, right, for Dave, we're constantly able to, looking at our flywheel and see how this all comes together, looking at our flywheel, we're always able to say, all right, this is the flywheel. This is our model. Right? These are the levers. These are the things. Now let's put the levers into the scenario. What is the reality, right? We don't call it a scenario. It's the reality. And now let's run some scenarios. If we focus on increasing our sales conversion rate, right? Like increasing from 2% to 3%, what is the result? Well, what's it going to take for us to do that, right? Are we neglecting that area, or have we maxed out all of our ideas? All right, let's put that aside. What are we doing in terms of AOV? and what if we increased AOV by 10% or 20% or 30%? What's the likelihood of us doing that? What are we doing right now, like that what aren't we doing right now that we could do to increase our AOV from, call it 30 to 100? Or have we maxed everything out? Like, are we doing the best of the best that we know how to do from an AOV perspective? And right now we're at 30 and we're using a scenario that's going to get us to 100. Well, this is why I say to you guys and gals that you've got to bring these scenarios back to reality. Like, if we've got a campaign that's operating at, call it a $30 AOV, and I think most of our front end campaigns, correct me if I'm mistaken, Damien, are like 45 to 60-ish front end value. But if we've got a campaign that was at $30 of $30 AOV, and we've done everything that we could, well, what are we going to do to get it to $100 AOV? Like, why even entertain that, right? That scenario, what are we going to do? It sounds great on paper and it looks great on paper and it all works out on paper, but now we've got to bring it over to, well, what would we do? Just like when we're looking at, we go from, the reason why we didn't say, well, what happens if we go from 2% to 5% on our sales conversion into E5 buyers? Yeah, well, sure. Hey, while we're at it, let's look at 15%. You know what I mean? Let's look at right? But that's not going to happen, right? The reality is it's not going to happen. So you got to stay within reality when looking at these numbers. And you got to I like to look at small incremental increases. We didn't say going from 2 to 8%. What if we go from 2 to 3? Right? And that's it. Does it change things radically? What if we go from an AOV of 65 to 75, or an AOV of 65 to 85, right? Like, you have to stay within, and look at some scenarios and realize, that's just not going to happen, right? Like, to go from a $30 AOV to a $100 AOV, if we've maxed out on that campaign, is either going to require a radical change in the offer, the price point of that offer. Something radically is going to need to change. right, like we're not talking optimizing anymore. We're talking like a redo on that campaign. And so does that make sense, Damien?
It does. And I want to answer a question because actually both Clayton T and Glenn Krieger are asking me the same question, which is where do you factor in, and I'll answer this question myself, where do you factor in like those other alternative products? So let's say we get 1,000 leads, a certain amount of them buy the front end product, and then some of them send to coaching, but we still have these leads. And, well, what if we sell them a different product, an affiliate offer, different stuff down the road? And what I explained to Clayton and Glenn is the way that we look at it for everybody here is that's icing. Look, when you run these scenarios, your scenarios need to work based on your core business and your core offers. So the fact that you're like, well, when they don't buy this, I have this little downsell offer. It's an old product I sell, or this, that's all great. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing those things, but you don't want to count on your economics working based upon the fact that, well, out of the 98% of the leads that don't convert, I sell them some other little digital thing 45 days later, and I get a couple bucks from that.
With an exception. Yeah. And Damien is absolutely right? Like, look, well, I make affiliate offers, right? Like I'm not banking it. I'm not banking our business, right? Like right. I'm not banking our business.
Or even non-E5 offers, right? We have an old product in the catalog that we still just put out once in a while. We're not banking on that.
Yeah. But is when you get it, when it's dialed, like, so when it becomes part of the system. What I mean by that is that if you look at our flywheel, one more time, you look at our flywheel one more time, you see that it says over here, sell E5. And Damien shared yesterday that there are two E5 programs. There is the coaching program and there is the self-study. And so what happens is when somebody doesn't take advantage of the coaching because either they don't qualify, right? So we've disqualified them on the application. They don't buy through, the sales dude or sales team, whatever. They don't do that. They're put into a campaign to sell them the self-study. Once that branch of the campaign is dialed in, then sure, then we're going to use that, right? Like then we're going to use that, but right, because it becomes a dialed in branch off of the campaign. But stuff like, we've got a product suite of offers that aren't even public that we roll out, and not like we don't look at it like that because it's not dialed half of the time, or most of the time we're doing these broadcast campaigns. And so there's no, like my confidence level in the money that those will produce is very low. Not that they won't produce money, but how much to use that money to decide how much I'm going to pay to acquire an asset, I'm just not willing to do.